So, today I'm going to talk about one of the most important of all the liberties we possess, religious liberty. Individuals must be free to worship God according to the dictates of their religious convictions and to act upon those convictions whenever possible. To deny people this freedom is fundamentally unjust. Unfortunately, governments often desire to promote and protect what they consider to be true religion. This is true even when Christians are in charge. From 325, when Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, to the founding of the American colonies, it was common for civic authorities to promote, again, what they consider to be true religion. This often included discriminating against or even persecuting those who deviated from the ruler's understanding of Christian orthodoxy. America's earliest colonists, from the north to the south, were not immune from this temptation. Fortunately, or should I say providentially, the way Americans approached religious liberty changed in important ways between the early colonies and the founding era. They did so for several reasons, but I'll just mention two. First, in spite of the desire for homogeneity, almost from the start, America attracted diverse groups of immigrants from England and continental Europe. Even in congregational New England and the Anglican South, there were, from an early date, dissenters. And the middle colonies, states like Pennsylvania and New York, were always a muddle. These colonists had to learn how to live together peacefully. But, even more important, colonial officials were confronted with powerful arguments for the liberty of conscience. Men such as the Quaker William Penn, the Baptist Roger Williams, Elisha Williams, John Leland, and others contended that a proper understanding of the Bible requires religious liberty for all. These arguments convinced early American colonies to become increasingly tolerant, and by the American founding, many civic leaders were coming to understand that religious liberty is a natural right, not simply a gift of the state. Debates in Virginia illustrate this shift well. In 1776, the Virginia Convention created a committee to write a Bill of Rights. This task largely fell to George Mason of Virginia, who drafted what became Article 16 of the Declaration of Rights. It reads, and I'm quoting here, that as religion, or the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not force or violence, and therefore that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, unpunished and unrestrained by the magistrate. That draft, which was printed and circulated throughout the states, was enormously influential. But it was not the draft that became law. James Madison, in his first significant public act, objected to the use of the word toleration in the article, believing that it implied that religious liberty was a grant from the state that could be revoked at will. The Virginia Convention agreed, and the article was amended to make it clear that the free exercise of religion is a right, not a privilege granted by the state. Note as well in passing that Mason grounds his argument on the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator, that persons must understand they must fulfill as best they understand. All right, so by the end of the Revolutionary era, every state offered significant protection for religious liberty. The federal Constitution of 1787 did not, but only because its supporters believed that the national government did not have the delegated power to pass laws interfering with religious beliefs or practices. In the face of popular outcry, the first Congress proposed, and the states ratified, a constitutional amendment prohibiting Congress from restricting the free exercise of religion. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution also prohibits religious tests for office. Now, in the ratification debate, some anti-federalists argued that this would permit a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist to be elected to federal office. The Federalists responded that this outcome was unlikely, although today we do have Jews and Muslims and atheists serving in Congress. This is absolutely appropriate, as religious liberty belongs to all citizens, not just Christians. And it's a liberty protected by Article 6. So the exact scope of religious liberty protected by the First Amendment has been hotly debated. But at a minimum, it prohibits Congress from, in the words of James Madison, compelling men to worship God in any manner contrary to their conscience. It certainly means more than that, but exactly how much more is controversial. Particularly divisive, even among originalists, is the question of whether the Free Exercise Clause requires religious exemptions to general, neutrally applicable laws. Now, the founders knew of these sorts of conflicts, and they addressed them by creating something known as religious accommodations, sometimes called religious exemptions. Let me give you just one example: military service. So, among the many roles of the civil government, few are as important as national security. In the modern era, states and nations have regularly relied upon compulsory military service or conscription to raise armies. Religious pacifists often ask to be excused from such service. Now, I want you to consider for a minute the government's options when faced with these requests. Rather than force pacifists to act against their sincerely held religious convictions, civic leaders might eliminate the draft requirement altogether. But, assuming conscription is necessary for self defense, doing so might harm the public, conceivably dramatically. On the other hand, the state might just go ahead and force pacifists to serve in the military or jail or execute them if they refuse. Alas, too many governments have taken this approach. Fortunately, America's civic leaders have chosen a third way. Most early colonies required that adult males serve in the military. Members of the Society of Friends, better known as Quakers, were often pacifists who refused to do so. As early as the 1670s, a few colonies began excusing them from military service, provided they pay a fine or a hired substitute. All colonies did so by the mid-18th century, often expanding accommodations to include other religious citizens. During the War for American Independence, the Continental Congress supported these accommodations with the following July 1875 resolution. As there are some people who, from religious principles, cannot bear arms in any case, this Congress intend no violence to their consciences, but earnestly recommend it to them to contribute liberally in this time of universal calamity to the relief of their distressed brethren in the several colonies, and to do all other services to their oppressed country, which they can consistently with their religious principles. So Congress here is explicitly endorsing religious exemptions or accommodations to protect pacifists. 14 years later, during the debates in the First Federal Congress of the Bill of Rights, James Madison proposed a version of what became the Second Amendment that stipulated that, quote, no person religiously scrupulous shall be compelled to bear arms. His proposal was approved by the House, but not by the Senate. And it was ultimately rejected, but only because founders thought that legislatures should pass such protections. And I'm happy to report that they did. States and later Congresses regularly provide religious pacifists with the option of serving their country in ways other than fighting. In World War I, pacifists from certain denominations were permitted to do alternative service, and in World War II and to the present day, all religious pacifists are permitted to do so. Thank goodness they are. Well, let's fast forward. So I hope you're with me and agree that we should protect the rights of religious minorities. This is the right thing to do. Religious majorities can protect themselves. It's religious minorities who need protection. Generally, I'm pleased to report that in America, the state and national governments have only become better at protecting religious liberty. By the mid-20th century, with few, if any exceptions, no government attempted to ban religious belief or practice per se. Threats to religious liberty came almost solely from neutral laws of general applicability. We've already talked about military service, but other areas include things such as oath requirements, laws requiring school children to salute the American flag, bans on narcotics such as peyote, and compulsory school attendance laws. In the latter part of the 20th century, the Supreme Court developed a framework for thinking through how to accommodate religious objectors to general laws. In 1963, under the leadership of the liberal Justice William J. Brennan, the court adopted the principle that government actions that burden a religious practice must be justified by a compelling state interest. Later, the court added the requirement that this interest must be pursued in the least intrusive means possible, the least restrictive means possible. When a majority of Supreme Court justices repudiated this test in the 1990 case of Oregon versus Smith, a case involving the use of peyote in Oregon, Congress enacted a law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 to restore it. Now, hold on to your hats. This is amazing. This bill was passed in the House of Representatives without a dissenting vote by 97-3 in the Senate, and it was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. Democrats and Republicans could come together to protect religious liberty. There was a consensus in the late 20th century that religious liberty should be protected whenever possible. Alas, in the 21st century, the consensus seems to be unraveling. Robert P. George at Princeton University observed a few years ago that there is a massive assault on religious liberty going on in this country right now. Now, most civic leaders and jurists remain committed to religious liberty in the abstract, but support for protecting citizens from neutral laws that infringe upon their religious convictions has deteriorated. Let me give you a few instances. At the national level, the Obama administration showed little concern for religious liberty when it required businesses to provide contraceptive devices and abortifacients to employees, even though these business owners had religious convictions against doing so. I'm thinking of the Hobby Lobby case here. The Obama administration also offered a rare challenge to the doctrine of ministerial exception, a legal protection which holds that religious groups should be free to choose, in the words of Chief Justice John Roberts, quote, who will preach their beliefs, teach their faith, and carry out their mission. In the academy, professors Marcy Hamilton, Brian Leiter, Richard Schrager, Micah Schwartzman, John Corvino, and others have made well-publicized arguments contending that citizens should seldom, if ever, be exempted from general laws that are neutrally applied because of their religious convictions. Particularly worrisome is their contention that religious commitments are no more important than commitments one might have to a baseball team or a game of chess. On the legal front, others have contended that religious accommodations, or at least some of them, violate the Establishment Clause. From an originalist perspective, these arguments have absolutely no merit. The rejection of religious liberty often comes with outright animus or hatred towards people of faith. For example, Martin R. Castro, chair of the United States Civil Rights Commission, noted in his personal statement for a 2016 report that, quote, the phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy, so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any form of intolerance. A majority of these commissioners recommended repealing or curtailing laws passed by bipartisan majorities that have offered significant protection to persons of faith. Now, Castro is referring to cases like the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission. This litigation involved Jack Phillips, a baker who declined to bake a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding ceremony in 2012. Phillips is a Christian who runs his store according to his religious convictions. So he refuses to make cakes, for instance, celebrating divorces, or celebrating Halloween, or celebrating same-sex marriage ceremonies. Among his central arguments is that when he is creating a custom cake, he is using his creative talents to communicate a message. He is willing to sell the same-sex couple any pre-made item in a store, but he cannot in good conscience celebrate same-sex marriage by baking a custom cake. The Colorado Civil Rights Commission found that Phillips violated a state ordinance that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In doing so, they rejected his arguments that the First Amendment, both the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech, protected his decision. The United States Supreme Court ruled that the commission had acted with such clear anti-religious animus that it violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. But these are very narrow grounds. Phillips is already being sued again, and if the commission hides its anti-religious bias, he may not prevail next time around. Religious liberty cannot depend upon anti-religious bigots not being open about their animus. America's founders were profoundly influenced by Christianity, but they did not design a constitutional order only for their fellow believers. This fact is understood by most civic leaders and jurists, but alas, there are exceptions to every rule. For instance, 28% of Americans favor a ban on building mosques in their communities, and some citizens continue to argue that the First Amendment does not protect Muslims. The founders explicitly prohibited religious tests for federal office, and they understood that doing so would permit a pagan, a deist, a Mohammedan, or a Muslim to be elected. They undoubtedly thought that some of these outcomes would not be ideal, but others may well have thought it would be better to vote for, say, a reasonable, competent Sikh rather than an irrational, incompetent Christian. In 1790, George Washington wrote a letter to the Hebrew Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. At the time, there were only about 2,000 Jews in America, so this was not a powerful constituency that needed to be cultivated. Nevertheless, he proclaimed that, and here I'm quoting, all possess alike liberty and conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasion their effectual support. All who would live up to the founders' ideal for the freedom of conscience must insist that, except in the most extreme of circumstances, every American has a right to live according to his or her religious convictions, no matter how unpopular they may be. This includes permitting florists not to participate in same-sex wedding ceremonies, permitting Jehovah's Witnesses to not have to salute and pledge allegiance to the American flag, and allowing Muslims to build mosques on the same terms that Christians can build churches. The moment we start picking and choosing which convictions we protect and which we don't is the moment we abandon the founders' commitment to defending what many of them called the sacred rights of conscience. Thank you very much.